Optimism in Action is produced in collaboration with KAZU, your NPR station for the Monterey Bay area of California. You'll find this episode and archived episodes at kazu.org/sidebar.
We've come to the perspective that we really need to think of local news in the way we do other institutions that are essential to our community, that we don't rely solely on the market, like our museums, our libraries, these institutions that help weave us together, that we know are essential to a thriving community, and that we support in multiple ways. But importantly, one of those ways is through philanthropy.
That's today's guest on Sidebar Optimism in Action, Sarabeth Berman, the CEO of the American Journalism Project.
Sidebar is brought to you by Monterey College of Law, San Luis Obispo College of Law, Kern County College of Law, and Empire College of Law, located in Santa Rosa.
Welcome to Sidebar, featuring conversations about optimism in action with lawyers and leaders inspiring change. And now your co-hosts, Jackie Gardina and Mitch Winnick.
I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to this episode of Sidebar, Optimism in Action. Our guest today is Sarabeth Berman. Sarabeth is the CEO of the American Journalism Project, a venture philanthropy dedicated to rebuilding local news. And that is something we want to learn more about because, as most of us know, the challenge to keep local media and local news alive and well is a significant challenge that appears to be getting more challenging, not less so. I'm very pleased to have as my guest co-host today, Pam Marino. Pam Marino is the senior writer for the Monterey County Weekly that also publishes Monterey Now, a daily digital publication. So Pam is living and breathing every day the challenges that Sarabeth and her organization are trying to work to improve. Welcome to both of you to Sidebar. Sarabeth, tell us a little of the story of how did you get to the American Journalism Project?
Sure. I had the great pleasure of joining the American Journalism Project as its first CEO in March 2020, an auspicious moment to start. My own path to this is not as a journalist, but as someone who cares a lot about investing in our communities and building strong nonprofit civic organizations. I had a winding path to this. I started my career in China, first in Hong Kong and then in Beijing. I was in the performing arts there, where I learned a lot about what it takes to bring people together. I then helped to build Teach for China, which is based on Teach for America, which some of the listeners may be familiar with. And I learned a lot about how to build a strong nonprofit news organization. I also, along the way, met my husband, who's a journalist. So I kind of married into journalism. He was a foreign correspondent in Beijing at the time, working for the Chicago Tribune and then for the New Yorker magazine. And in fact, we were there right around the 2008 Olympics, also right around the financial crisis, where the first wave of significant financial hardship in newspapers was really felt. And so many of our peers, our friends in the foreign correspondent community went home because the newspapers could no longer afford to have foreign correspondents. So we really felt the beginnings of the market failure in local news there quite viscerally. We came back to the US in 2013, and I took a job working for an extraordinary social entrepreneur named Wendy Kopp, who founded Teach for America and an organization called Teach for All. And I worked for her at Teach for All, helping to support nonprofit education enterprises all over the world in 60 countries around the world. And there I learned about what it takes to help build and scale and help organizations learn from each other. In 2019, I got a call from a woman named Elizabeth Green, who founded an excellent nonprofit newsroom called Chalkbeat, which covers education in many communities across the country. And she had joined forces with an individual named John Thornton, who was a venture capitalist based in Texas, who founded the Texas Tribune, which is now regarded as one of the gold stars of nonprofit news and really built a successful business model. And the two of them started the American Journalism Project in the hopes of helping to replicate and grow nonprofit newsrooms across the country. They'd seen the early success in the industry and wanted to help accelerate that. And they approached me because of my background in helping nonprofits learn from each other, grow, and become sustainable.
And remind us again, what was the time frame?
I joined, as I mentioned, in March 2020, a moment where people really felt the need for local news, and local specifically. If you take yourself back to that beginning of the pandemic, what you were worried about was what was happening in your community. And yet at the same time, we were entering a really consequential time in our economy, and newsrooms were furloughing reporters, laying off reporters. And so you just felt so clearly the challenge that we're confronting right now, which is a business model that has, quite frankly, fallen apart. And we like to call it a market failure, a public good that people really need, that we can't survive without. And so that was the founding premise behind the American Journalism Project and what brought me to the work.
I agree with you about market failure. Journalism is a market failure, and also that it is a public good. So how do we rebuild that public good? We had it going for a while. It's failing. How do we rebuild where we can continue the public good?
For 150 years, we had a business model that was really successful. It was a huge wealth maker in our country. About 70% of revenue was coming from advertising. The rest was coming from subscriptions. Basically, newspapers had a monopoly on advertising revenue. And of course, the rise of the internet fundamentally dismantled that business model. And so then the question for us is, how do you sustain local news in this climate? We've come to the perspective that we really need to think of local news in the way we do other institutions that are essential to our community, that we don't rely solely on the market, like our museums, our libraries, these institutions that help weave us together, that we know are essential to a thriving community, and that we support in multiple ways. But importantly, one of those ways is through philanthropy. So we have invested in helping to build the philanthropic market for local news. We are seeing thriving nonprofit news organizations that are building diverse revenue models. They're bringing in philanthropy from foundations, from individuals. They're going to readers and saying, donate to us or become a member or subscribe to us, not just because you want the value exchange of this content, but also because you believe this is important to your community. They're building sponsorship relationships with companies and local businesses. And of course, there's still some advertising revenue. It's just far diminished from where it was. And they're hosting events and finding other creative ways to bring in revenue for the organization.
And are you seeing results?
We are seeing increasingly more nonprofit news organizations all over the country. The industry has really ballooned over the past several years. There are now hundreds of nonprofit newsrooms.
Can you give us some numbers that will help us understand the scale of what you're doing?
In our portfolio, we've invested in 50 nonprofit news organizations across 37 states, serving 100 communities. We raise philanthropic dollars at the American Journalism Project. We then reinvest it in nonprofit news organizations. And we do that to help them build up their business and revenue teams. And then we help them run excellent fundraising campaigns, make the case to philanthropy that if you care about, say, education or climate or criminal justice, you should be concerned about whether or not your community is armed with the information they need around those issues. We help them grow their audience and then turn to their audience and say, please support this news. Increasingly, we're seeing this kind of reimagination of the model working.
And one of the things that it strikes me is so critical in this effort is what we hear about are the ethics of journalism. We took for granted there's an editor at the local news, someone who will still respond if we think they have misstated a story or actually have a story that needs to be corrected. You're competing with a digital marketplace. There is no there. There are no editors. There are no standards. There's no accountability. How do you approach that element? Because I think that's part and parcel of getting philanthropy to support this and getting the community to see how important this is.
Trust in the news and information in this country is at an all-time low, but local news still maintains people's trust. And it is really because of what you just described it there, which is that It is accountable to communities. You know your local journalists. You can see whether or not their stories are true or not because they're about the communities that you know. You can hold them accountable when you see them at the supermarket where someone says you did not get that story right. It's one of the reasons why we think it is so important to have local reporting and local institutions, because they are the sort of path to shared, trusted information in a community. And it's why we believe in funding new local news institutions and not just funding journalism creators. We think it is important to have an institution that holds itself accountable for keeping a community informed.
One of the things that I've been really concerned with lately, I've been asking my young family members, like nieces and nephews, where do you get your news? And actually, I give them a lot of credit. They try to get it from sources that they can trust. So good for them. They're not just reading stuff off of Facebook or Instagram and going, oh no. They're really looking for something that is credible. But they're not saying, I'm reading my local paper. I work for a local paper. So that worries me because I'm like, well, our readership probably skews older, but what about the next generation? Are they going to turn to us? So how do you all combat that in working with all these local news outlets? How do they connect to younger readers and viewers?
The organizations we support are delivering local news where audiences are, in their inboxes, on social media, in text message, on WhatsApp. They're not delivering it through a paper that shows up on your doorstep every morning. We just helped launch a new nonprofit newsroom in LA recently called the LA Local. If you go to their website, thelalocal.org, you will see vertical videos. You'll see these journalists on Instagram, on TikTok, talking to their community. But what they are delivering is original reporting, which is what American newspapers have always delivered for our country. For us, this is about saving original reporting, but being platform agnostic, allowing these organizations to be really creative about how they reach audiences. We fund this fantastic news organization in Detroit called Outlier Media. One of their primary distribution mechanisms is text message. They text Detroiters with information and stories and things they believe that Detroiters need to read. And a benefit of that is that Detroiters can text them back. And they have a relationship with their readers that is really two-way. Or we fund news organizations that have WhatsApp newsletters that are putting their reporters in front of their cell phones and talking to their audiences through their reporting. And we think that's really important.
It would seem to me that given that explanation, you also have knocking on your door traditional local media who might be looking at these things and saying, wow, that sounds great. We don't have anybody doing that in our community. Maybe we should be doing that in our community, but we're traditional print media. We have no clue how to get there. Is there pressure on you to help retrain existing local media to expand their work into these types of opportunities?
We are absolutely seeing some of the more legacy institutions transitioning. One of the organizations we support is the Salt Lake Tribune, which has over a century of history, but they also now have a robust digital audience. They have newsletters, they have social media, they have an active website. So yes, they still have print subscribers, but they have been able to really transition to a digital forward news organization. In Tulsa, we recently helped launch a new news organization called the Tulsa Flyer. And that new nonprofit news organization merged with the Oklahoma Eagle, which is over a century-old black paper in Tulsa. The Goodwin family that owned the paper decided that they would donate this asset to this new nonprofit. They still print the paper, but they also now, through their partnership with the Tulsa Flyer, have a really digital forward news site that's publishing on Instagram and social media and delivering this news that has been a mainstay of the community for over 100 years in new formats.
That's awesome. And I'm just wondering if you could share some other examples of how news organizations are connecting with their readers. I've heard of doing it through text. We haven't gone there. We're getting ready to go into WhatsApp, but do you have some more examples?
One thing that's interesting is how many of our news organizations are doing good old-fashioned in real life encounters with their audiences, meaning events. And we see that people are really craving for in-person connection. So there's a lot of opportunity for live reporting. One excellent example of this is the Texas Tribune, which I mentioned earlier. They run a wonderful festival every year called Trib Fest, where they do dozens and dozens of panels and conversations where they're bringing people together. And many of our news organizations do something similar. We do find just connecting and building trust in person is so important. We also see people delivering news through the major social media channels, increasingly on video, because we see younger audiences really do prefer consuming news through video. So that means YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. And email newsletters have been really important to these news organizations. Shows up in your inbox. And the rise of Substack, which I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with, is an example of how much people really do like getting trusted news in their inbox. And we find that's a really great funnel for revenue, because you can have a little button at the end of the newsletter saying, please support this news.
Support for Optimism in Action comes from the Monterey College of Law, a nonprofit law school serving the Monterey Bay region with evening classes on campus or in a hybrid online format. More details and applications available at montereylaw.edu. That's montereylaw.edu.
Let me go back to something I raised earlier, because you raised it here, particularly with young people who are using social media and these other digital routes to get what they're calling news. Maybe it's just that I'm old-fashioned and stuck in a box, but I worry that there aren't standards for what is being determined and distributed as social media news. They read about it in their social media feed. They have access, sometimes to millions of people, to go out and report it back out with their take. But there's no structure to that. There's no oversight, there's no editing, there's no collaboration. I suspect nothing in Pam's operation ever gets printed or onto the website without another set of eyes having looked at it and said, wait a minute, where did you get this? What's the basis?
The organizations we support are all using the same rigorous standards for trusted, fact-based information, but they are delivering it in the form where people are.
Now that I know, if it's an American Journalism Project media outlet, it has those standards. But I don't know that when I'm just listening to those stories and scrolling through my news feed.
This is the challenge of our time. The challenge of our time is how people decode what they can and can't trust. And I think the bet that we're making is that the more local you are, the more connected people feel to their communities, the more they'll be able to verify whether or not the information is true or not. And that seems to show up in the data. It is why people trust local information more than they trust national information. So the bet that we're making is that we need to refill our communities with fact-based original reporting, and that will help us build back trust in shared fact and information.
Are people getting the idea that, and I mean people out in the communities, are they getting the idea that without a local news organization, they are a great risk in terms of being a news desert and all that comes with it, all the issues that can happen with problems in local government, and the information's out there as to what can happen to a community when they lose their local newspaper? Do people get that, and are they willing to pay for the news that they get? How are you all experiencing that in terms of people donating to these news organizations?
What we find is that if you actively make the case for why local news matters, it is intuitive to people and people will support it, but you have to make that case. And journalists for a long time did not have to make the case for why they mattered and why they existed. And now you really do. I think about a newsroom that we support called Mississippi Today, which started in 2016 by a group of philanthropists and journalists. They had a young reporter named Anna Wolf who saw a statistic that only 1.5% of families in Mississippi were being approved for welfare funding. she started trying to understand, like, how could this possibly be true in the poorest state in the country? And as she pulled the thread and worked sources and asked questions, she ultimately unraveled that millions of dollars of welfare funding was being misused and channeled towards the pet projects of the politically collected and elite in Mississippi and not towards poor families where it was intended to go. That was revealed because there was original reporters in that community who were trying to understand what was happening. And that would have never gone revealed if it were not. And so it is often hard for people to know a counterfactual. So you have to really do the work of making the case for the importance of this work and of local journalism. Then we do see that people like local news. They want local news, and they are willing to support it if you make that case and ask them to.
And what it sounds like is you're making the case that particularly local philanthropy and the willingness to support local news has to become part of a sustainable business model. I like the idea that you came into this obviously with a more organizational business mindset, having a strategic plan and bringing this strategy into not just this organization, but into the organizations that you're engaging with and supporting. How hard has it been to make the case that philanthropy now must be part of the permanent business model to keep this type of local news available?
I think it's getting easier, partially because in the beginning of the erosion of the American paper, people trusted that the market would resolve it. Maybe Silicon Valley would figure out some silver bullet solution to get original reporting into communities. And I think that over the past several years, it has become exceedingly clear to people that that is not going to happen. Philanthropy really won't step in. So increasingly, we are seeing more philanthropists step into this space. And when we talk about philanthropy, we're thinking very expansively. We're not just talking about a small handful of very famous institutional funders like the Ford Foundation or the MacArthur Foundation. We're talking about a massive multi-billion-dollar sector in our country, which is we have tax incentives to give money away. And we need to be making the case to those people who have put money aside to give away that this should be part of their priority list.
So, Sarabeth, what's the average size of these organizations that you're supporting? Just from a practical standpoint, how big of an organization does one need? Because reporting's time-consuming, putting out some kind of product, either print or digitally, is time-consuming, social media is time-consuming. So I'm just curious, like, how this news organizations are making this all work. And then the other question is, are these organizations able to pay a living wage to their employees?
All good questions. So a living wage is key to this. We believe in professional journalism. In fact, most of the nonprofits that we support are providing salaries that are increases from legacy news institutions. No one's getting rich from this, but we need them to be able to provide for their families and stay in this work. In terms of the size of the organization, I mean, the truth is it really depends on the market, right? We're serving everything from a statewide news organization like the Texas Tribune, which has close to 100 reporters, to Cleveland and Akron, which have several dozen reporters. News organizations are definitely going to be smaller than what they were in the heyday of the American newspaper, but we do see a path towards building nonprofit news organizations in communities.
Sarabeth, our program's Optimism in Action. Clearly you have the passion and the drive and the interest in this, and you are a believer. But what makes you optimistic that this will work, that this really will be a turning point to bring back the type of trust and news coverage and within each community that we once took for granted?
I'm incredibly optimistic about this work, and for a few reasons. One is we've done some work to really assess, like, what is minimum viable journalism for our democracy? How much journalism do we need across this country? How many journalists do we need? And we've made some assumptions. Several other organizations have done the same. And we get to needing to build a $1 to $2 billion nonprofit news industry across the country. That's the assumption we're making. Right now, the nonprofit news industry is around $300 million. When we started in this work, I mentioned 2020, it was less than 100 million. So this new generation of nonprofit news, it has tripled since the American Journalism Project started in 2019. And to get to $1 billion industry, it sounds like a lot, but if you think about the performing arts, we spend about $2.5 billion a year in philanthropy for the performing arts in our country. I think it is very reasonable to say that you could build a culture of support for local news that could get you to an $1 billion industry across the country. So first of all, I think it is a solvable problem. The other reason why I feel a lot of optimism is I see it working in communities across the country. For the last 3 years in a row, the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting has gone to a new nonprofit newsroom that didn't exist a decade earlier. So we're seeing these organizations do incredibly high quality journalism. And then our portfolio is growing their revenue. They're growing their audiences. We're seeing everything headed in the right direction. While it's certainly not a silver bullet, and I think it will take time, we often talk about this in generational terms. It took a generation for this industry to unravel. I think it's going to take a generation to rebuild it. There's real reason to believe it is doable. And it's really thrilling to see communities and these entrepreneurs across the country trying to build these new organizations.
Sarabeth, as we wrap up, what would you say to those listening who want to get involved in their own local community? What is it they can do? What should they be looking for?
Support your local newspaper. Whether you have a local nonprofit news organization that you should be donating to, a local paper that you should be subscribing to, it is really important to make sure that your community has information. And part of that is you supporting it.
Tell us how to learn more about the American Journalism Project.
We are at theajp.org. You can see our website there. On it, you can find a list of all the news organizations we support, and you can go check out their sites as well.
The successes you've already been able to discuss really do make me optimistic that this is a possibility. I would not have said at the beginning of this program that I would list the survival of local journalism as an optimistic area, but you have convinced me.
I'm so glad to hear it.
Me too.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Pam, as a local journalist, what are your thoughts about what we've learned about Sarabeth Berman and the American Journalism Project?
I was really impressed with Sarabeth. I thought she made some really great points. One of the things that stuck out to me at the end is when she said, we in this country spend $2.5 billion on the performing arts. And it's like, yeah, why can't we spend that amount or more on local journalism? To me, it seems totally doable, but it's going to take time. I mean, clearly she also said it unraveled in a generation. It's going to take a generation to build it up, but she made it sound possible, which I really appreciated.
I agree with much of what you said about Sarabeth Berman's comments about the American Journalism Project. I found that the transition they're suggesting towards local philanthropic support of journalism and news, personally, I find that very compelling. Whether that can take over and replace the traditional business model of journalism, I don't know. And I'm sure they don't know yet. But the success they've had in a very few years really tells me that this may be the answer. This may be how we develop a new business model to sustain local news and information. And I'm looking forward to seeing their successes in the future.
I agree, and I think you're going to see some traditional news organizations aren't going to make it because they're not making the transition to social media well. I think those news organizations that do adopt some of the things that Sarabeth was talking about, more social media presence, more videos, live events, the newspapers that go that route, the ones that can make that transition will survive. The ones that can't won't, and they'll hopefully be replaced by all of these nonprofit news organizations that are popping up.
Pam, tell us how our listeners can read more about you on the Monterey County Weekly.
Monterey County Weekly, the print version comes out every Thursday, but every story goes up online at midnight. Monterey County Now is our digital products, and in addition to our blog, which is updated daily with new news and information, We have Monterey County Now. It's an award-winning newsletter, so we have a lot of good engagement with the community. Those are the places you can find our news and information on a daily basis, in addition to the print paper that comes out on Thursdays.
Pam, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mitch.
Once again, I want to thank everyone who joined us today on Sidebar. And as always, Mitch and I would love to know what's on your mind. You can reach us at sidebarmedia.org.
Sidebar would not be possible without our producer, David Eakin, who composes and plays all of the music you hear on Sidebar. Thank you also to Dina Dowsett, who creates and coordinates Sidebar's social media marketing.
Optimism in Action is produced in collaboration with KAZU, your NPR station for the Monterey Bay area of California. You'll find this episode and archived episodes at kazu.org/sidebar.